A millionaire fired his maid without a word, then found her freezing on a park bench. What he did next stunned the entire world. The snow was falling quietly over the city, coating everything in silence and cold. It was one of those evenings where even the wealthy hurried indoors, escaping the bitter wind. But on a forgotten bench in a small park near the financial district, a woman in a navy blue uniform sat alone, her body leaning lifelessly to one side. She was barely visible under the white frost settling on her apron. That woman was Grace. For the past 3 years, Grace had worked in the home of millionaire Charles Whitaker, a man known more for his bank account than for compassion. His mansion was grand, his routine sharp, and his expectations even sharper. Charles didn't know much about Grace beyond her punctuality, her quiet steps, and the way she always kept the fireplace crackling before he came down each morning. To him, she was efficient, invisible, useful, nothing more. He never asked where she went after work, never cared to know what her life looked like outside his marble halls. So when Grace showed up 5 minutes late last Friday morning, eyes red, hands trembling, Charles didn't ask questions. He simply said, "You're done here," and dismissed her. No severance, no recommendation letter, not even a thank you. Grace didn't plead. She just nodded and quietly walked out of the only warm place she had. What Charles didn't know was that Grace had been sleeping in the back corner of the laundry room for months. Ever since her mother's health collapsed back in Louisiana, Grace had sent home every dollar she earned to cover hospital bills and care for her younger brother. With rent prices rising and her hours cut recently, she had nowhere left to stay. She cleaned his home by day and hid in a broom closet at night. When he fired her, she didn't even have enough left for a bus ride. That night, in thin shoes and that same uniform, Grace wandered the city. The shelters were full. The stations were unsafe. Her phone had died. She sat on that bench, thinking she'd rest her eyes for just a moment. But the cold crept in faster than she expected. By morning, she couldn't feel her fingers. Charles Whitaker didn't usually walk to meetings, but that day his driver was late, and he had a boardroom to reach. Frustrated and checking his watch, he cut through the park near the edge of downtown. Snow crunched beneath his expensive shoes. Then he saw her. At first, he didn't recognize her. Her head was tilted, her lips slightly parted, breath shallow. Her arms were folded like a child trying to stay warm. Her uniform, dusted in snow, stood out against the slatted bench. He stepped closer. His heart skipped. "Grace," he said, confused. She didn't move. He crouched beside her, placed his hand on her shoulder, and flinched. Her skin was ice cold, her body limp. "Grace," he barked now, shaking her gently. "Grace, wake up." Still no response. Charles looked around. The park was empty. The early morning rush hadn't begun yet. Panic stirred in his chest. Not the kind that comes from missed meetings or market crashes. This was deeper, primal. He pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. As he waited, he stared at the woman he had never truly seen. Her skin was dusted in frost, her clothes thin and soaked, her headband slightly askew. She looked small, fragile, like someone who hadn't been okay for a long time, and he had never noticed. As the sirens approached, Charles knelt beside her, brushing snow from her arm with a shaking hand. He didn't care that his suit was getting wet. For the first time in a long time, his mind wasn't thinking about stock prices or business deals. It was thinking about her, the woman who brewed his tea at 6 a.m., the one who folded his shirts with care, the one he had let walk away without asking a single question. He remembered how she once smiled when the flowers bloomed near the kitchen window. He remembered nothing else. The ambulance doors opened. Charles helped lift her into the stretcher. As they drove away, he followed, not as her employer, but as a man finally realizing he may have destroyed someone just by not paying attention. And that realization broke something in him. He had built empires, but he'd failed to notice a woman freezing to death in silence right under his roof. The fluorescent lights above the emergency room cast a sterile glow, but Charles didn't blink. He sat beside the hospital bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw tense. Every so often, he glanced toward Grace, still unconscious, an oxygen mask over her face, for tubes running from her arm. The nurse had called her condition severe hypothermia. If she'd stayed out there another hour, she'd said, we'd be talking about a body recovery, not treatment. Charles hadn't said much. He couldn't, because for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he didn't know how to process what was happening. He had known Grace for 3 years, or at least he thought he did. But the woman lying in that bed wasn't just the maid. She was someone who had been suffering right beneath his nose, surviving in silence while working inside a palace. She didn't deserve this, and he had helped cause it. As the machines beeped and the nurses moved in and out, Charles remained, his expensive suit still dusted with melted snow. He ignored calls from board members, messages from his assistant, and even a text from his daughter asking if he was having a breakdown. He wasn't. He was waking up. It was nearly midnight when Grace stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips parted slowly, dry and cracked. Charles leaned forward, breath caught. "Grace," he said quietly. She turned her head, confused. Her voice was a whisper. "Am I dead?" He almost laughed, but there was no joy in it. "No," he replied. "You're alive. You're safe." Her brows furrowed as her eyes focused on him. She flinched. "Why are you here?" Charles swallowed hard. "Because I should have been long before today." Tears pulled in the corners of her eyes, and she turned her face toward the wall. "I didn't steal. I didn't lie. I was never late until that day." He nodded slowly. "And I never asked why. That's my shame, not yours." She didn't speak. He didn't leave. The next morning, Charles returned to his estate with a mission. He gathered his household staff, cooks, gardeners, drivers, and told them what had happened. No sugarcoating, no polished explanation, just truth. "I fired someone without understanding her story," he said, "and it nearly cost her life." His staff stood frozen. Some looked down. One woman cried. Then, shocking them all, Charles said something he'd never had in his entire career. "I'm sorry." Word spread quickly. So did the photo of Grace asleep on the bench, taken by a jogger who hadn't known who she was. It went viral. People online were outraged. How could a millionaire let this happen to someone who worked for him? Reporters showed up outside the hospital. Charles made no public comment. He only said, "I have more to do than talk." And he did. When Grace was discharged, a black town car waited at the door, but not to take her back to work. Charles stood beside it in a clean navy suit, holding a coat and a scarf in his hands. "This isn't charity," he said gently. "It's a correction." Grace didn't want to accept. Her pride was too strong. But the hospital bill alone would have buried her for years. He insisted, "Come stay in the guest wing, not to serve, but to recover. And when you're ready, we'll talk about what you want to do next. Not what I expect. With hesitation, she agreed. Over the next few weeks, Grace slowly healed. She stayed in a sunlit guest room, warm for the first time in months. Private doctor visited. Her brother and mother were flown in quietly, placed in a nearby apartment Charles leased in their name, and every evening Charles checked in, not as a boss, but as a man learning how to be human again. They talked over tea. She told him about her hometown, about burying her dreams to survive. And he listened, really listened for once. Then one morning, Charles made a quiet decision. He offered Grace a new position, Director of Staff and Employee Welfare across all his properties. A salaried role with benefits, leadership, and authority. Her job to make sure no one ever slipped through the cracks like she did. Grace paused. "You trust me with that?" Charles met her gaze. "I've never trusted anyone more." A few months later, at a charity gala hosted in the mansion's ballroom, Charles stepped to the microphone. "I once built skyscrapers and called myself powerful," he said. "But a woman I barely saw taught me what real strength looks like when she kept showing up to serve even when the world forgot her." Then he introduced Grace. In a simple navy blue dress, hair braided back, she took the stage to a room that once wouldn't have given her a second glance. But now they rose to their feet, not out of pity, but out of awe, because the maid no one noticed had become the woman who changed everything. And the man who once fired her finally found redemption, not through wealth, but through seeing someone he'd ignored too long. She was just the maid to him, but now, she's the reason he changed. If the story moved you, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, because we've got more powerful stories coming that remind us what really matters. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never forget to see the people around you.